It is the 4th of September, the year 476. It is a date that will enter the history books as one of the most momentous of all. For the Western Roman Empire, one of the most formidable powers to ever exist on planet Earth, is no more. Replaced politically by a mass of largely Germanic-speaking, so-called barbarian kingdoms and tribes. New groups of interwoven elites ruling chunks of land from the North Sea to Africa. The most famous ring out down the ages. Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Saxons and Franks. Others, forgotten now, then held just as much power. The Alemanii, Rugii, Suevi, Gepids. And yet, in many places, even under the rule of the newcomers, the old system carried on much as it had before. Latin continued to be spoken, Roman Christianity flourishing. Senators and governors going about their business. Though overwhelmingly, events in Italy and Rome itself had had little bearing on life in Europe for 50 years or more, great cities still flourished. Mighty armies of 10,000 and more still clashed. But what was the political and social landscape really like in those times? Was the deposition of the last emperor really that spectacular of an event? Was there, in reality, a great exaggeration of that fall? Join us on an epic journey from the mist-shrouded mountains of Scandinavia to the scorched deserts of Africa, as we turn the clock back to the final decades of the 5th century AD, to investigate every single state to hold sway in Europe and beyond in that fateful year. In all the lands and the shadowy border worlds of the Western Roman Empire. You're watching History Time. As always, I'm your host, Pete Kelly. A huge thank you to Maorianus, YouTube's premier channel on the fall of Rome, for researching and developing the script for this documentary, and to Damiano Petrucci for editing it. Shortly, we'll embark on our voyage. But first, a quick word from our sponsor. Thanks to Odoo for supporting education on YouTube. In the grand tradition of Rome's mighty engineers, why struggle with building your business website from scratch? Odoo is your modern-day aqueduct, delivering everything you need to manage your whole business effortlessly. With Odoo's powerful website configurator, you can launch your site in just 4 simple steps. No coding, no hassle, no barbarians at your gates. Enter the type of website, your field of activity, and your main objective. Choose a color palette or insert your logo. Add pages and features, and select your theme from a wide range available. Customize your website by dragging and dropping blocks, and if you so desire, let AI generate and refine your text. And the best part? The first app is free for life. Yes, like Rome's greatest roads, your site will stand the test of time with unlimited hosting and support. Access Odoo's full suite of business apps for a very affordable price. Conquer the web and build your site with Odoo today. Now, back to the ancient world. For centuries now, the study of history has been a mainstay in the West. Since the likes of Leopold van Ranke in the 19th century, it has often been classed as a rigorous system made up of firm endings and rigid beginnings. The end of the Roman Empire, one of the most studied epochs in all of history, is no exception. The hard end often being placed on a precise date in the year 476. For centuries now, that year has been placed on a pedestal as a great cataclysmic moment where the ancient civilization that once ruled the known world, lauded throughout the Middle Ages and even today, fell. A civilization that had achieved incredible feats of technology, engineering, artistry, and administration, ruling over the largest part of Europe for over a millennium. And with the fall of the empire, the historians wrote, so too did the ancient world come to an end. Antiquity gone, replaced by the so-called Middle Ages of relative barbarism between it and the re-emergence of greatness ushered in by the Renaissance and subsequent Enlightenment scholars. Of course, one of the most famous of those scholars, purporting a cataclysmic end in 476, and one still lauded today for his remarkable achievement in charting the entire decline and fall of the Roman Empire back in the 1780s, was Edward Gibbon. Now, almost 250 years later, with the benefit of a vast array of scholarship to add to the political events recorded by the Roman historians themselves, we know that 476 was not in fact some grand event, nor the destruction of an entire civilization. History is not entirely made up of great individuals and swift, immediate collapses. The truth is far more complicated. Rome did not burn that year, nor did any grand change take over Italy. The vast majority of Romans in both the peninsula and the city itself would not have witnessed anything out of the ordinary. For the masses, it was a year like any other. The only event of note, and one which so prominently entered the history books, was that for the very last time, an independent emperor ruled, before being swiftly deposed. But by that time, the entire Western Roman Empire consisted of little more than the divided states of Dalmatia and Italy. When the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustus, coincidentally bearing the names of both the legendary founder of Rome from well over 1,000 years in the past, and the very first emperor of some 500 years before, was replaced by the Germanic magnate Odoacer. It might seem strange that no popular uprising, nor sentiment of discontent is recorded in the sources. And yet, in reality, far from revulsion at the concept of a barbarian ruling over the remnants of the empire, Odoacer had the full backing of the Senate of Rome. The very same Senate which had never actually recognised Romulus Augustus as the rightful emperor in the first place. For there was another claimant too, Julius Nepos, ruling over the imperial province of Dalmatia, just across the Adriatic, to where he had been ousted from Rome the previous year. Far from the rightful man for the position, Romulus's father, Flavius Orestes, then serving as Magister Militum for Nepos, had risen up against his master, usurping the position of emperor to place his young son Romulus as a puppet on the throne. So then, far from the rightful last emperor, Romulus Augustus was a usurper, and when forced to abdicate by Odoacer on that September 4th, politically, it was not a spectacular event. Though historians have long drawn the map of Italy until 476 AD in red, calling it the Western Roman Empire, and afterwards a different colour, calling it suddenly the Kingdom of Odoacer. This is not how contemporary Romans viewed the situation, nor most modern historians. Because, of course, there was still a Roman emperor in those days, one to whom Odoacer, of course, pledged his full allegiance. Before that date, there had been many times without a Roman emperor. Times when the sole emperor of the Romans resided in the eastern capital of Constantinople. The great 4th century emperor Constantine himself, for example, resided at Constantinople, and during his rule there was no such thing as a Western Roman emperor. Likewise, when the Western Roman Emperor Eugenius was defeated by Theodosius the Great in 394 at the Battle of the Frigidus River, there also was no Western Roman Emperor for more than a year. Even more recently, with the murder of Valentinian III in 455, there was no Western Roman Emperor for almost 2 years. And on many other occasions during the last official century of Roman rule in the West, Germanic generals, not those bearing official titles, had been the real rulers of the state. From 395 to 408 AD, the Magister Militum Flavius Stilicho, a half-Vandal, not the young and inexperienced Emperor Honorius, wielded the real power in the West. And most notably, from 457 to 472, the Magister Militum Ricimer, more often than not, pulled the strings, even reigning for periods of time without an emperor subservient to him. So, when that Germanic ruler declared himself in charge of Italy in 476, it wasn't anything particularly new to the Romans. Odoacer perhaps just being slightly more brazen than the puppet masters of the past. From the perspective of the average citizen, all that had happened on that September 4th was that instead of a native Roman official ruling imperial Italy, there was now a Romanized Germanic one. Everything else remained exactly the same. There was no official Western Roman emperor anymore. But so what? There hadn't been one under Constantine, nor under Theodosius either. And besides, Italy was now officially a part of the Roman Empire again, under the eastern capital at Constantinople, and its still surviving rich provinces in Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and Syria. Odoacer was the representative of that Roman emperor, Zeno, minting coins in his name, and even being granted the honorary Roman title of Patricius. Under Odoacer, the Roman system continued much as it had before. Buildings were still repaired, taxes collected, and senates held. The city of Rome itself might actually have looked better in 480 than it did in 472, when it found itself devastated by civil war, given the stability of his firm-handed rule, life was probably better under Odoacer than it had been under the last Western Roman emperors. Whereas Rome had been sacked 3 times in the span of 62 years, in 410, 455 and 472. With Odoacer at the helm, ruling as a representative of the Eastern Empire, Rome was not sacked for many decades, enjoying a peace and stability that it had not known in almost a century. Fascinatingly, at this time, no mention of a fall is to be found anywhere in contemporary texts. Instead, the Senate, now undisputed rulers of the city of Rome and its surroundings, holding a prestige and power unheard of since the days of old, praised Odoacer and his court at the fortified city of Ravenna as patricius of the Romans, long after the supposed fall of the Western Roman Empire. There were even whispers and open talk of renewal. The main difference between the Rome of 476 and that of some 100 years before was the size of its population. The city had begun to decline rapidly after its first sack in 410, from around 800,000 in the year 400 to as low as around 200 or 250,000 in 476. And yet, it was still the largest and most visibly impressive city, not just in Italy, but in the entirety of Western Europe. Its ancient monuments, not just still standing, but still regularly repaired and maintained. And Ravenna, the administrative heart of Italy since the sack of Rome in 410, continued to flourish under Odoacer, notably enjoying favourable trade links with the Eastern Empire, and all the wealth of the East from its port at Classis. All things considered then, the so-called Kingdom of Odoacer does not resemble a Germanic successor state, but for all intents and purposes, a true continuation of the Roman Empire, albeit now officially a part of its eastern half. In 476, Italy was a province ruled over by a patricius. And during those decades of peace, with the cities of Italy prospering, Odoacer even managed to pacify all of the neighbouring Germanic realms, ultimately incorporating the kingdom of the Rugii into his domain. The realm of Julius Nepos was also annexed, after the murder of that last emperor by 2 of his own soldiers in 480. By that time, perhaps paradoxically, Italy was in a better shape than it had been before the so-called fall of Rome. So then, in 476 and the 2 decades afterwards, Latin was still spoken throughout Italy. World-spanning trade was still conducted. Great rhetoricians still wrote verbose texts, and the Senate still convened in the ancient city of Romulus and Remus, just as it had done for 1,000 years. But what of the rest of the empire, and of the barbarian lands of interlopers beyond? With the successful political outmanoeuvring and assassination of the Alanic kingmaker Aspar in 471, along with his entire extended family, the 50-year stranglehold of the so-called barbarian generals over the Eastern Empire was finally broken. The Emperor Leo, though free to dictate his own affairs once more, still needed strong military rulers to keep out the innumerable baying enemies of Constantinople. Promoting his own chosen barbarians from within the empire as a private army in order to do so. Enter the Isaurians, fierce mountain clans from the rugged southern interior of Asia Minor. And when Leo died in 474, he made sure the commander of the Isaurians, now his son-in-law, would succeed him. He'd been born Tarasis, but we know him by his imperial name, Zeno. Wildly unpopular with the Senate initially, Zeno was ousted just a year into his reign, though the conspirators themselves soon erupted into disarray. By August 476, just before the deposition of Romulus in Rome, Zeno returned to Constantinople with an army. The Senate opened the gates to the city, and the new emperor Basilicus was handed over. Exiled to Cappadocia, he would be made an example of. Eastern Roman historians claiming he and his entire family were enclosed in the dry cistern of a remote fort, left there to die slow deaths from exposure. By 476 then, not only was the eastern half of the Roman Empire still around, but its only real threats at that time came from within the state itself. Now, with the firm militaristic hand of Zeno back in charge, the state would continue unchanged from how it had operated for hundreds of years. In fact, with the reunification of the Eastern Empire, with Italy under Odoacer, the state now stretched from the deserts of Syria almost to southern Gaul, encompassing all the rich exotic lands between. The capital of the empire, of course, and beating heart where all roads led, remained Constantinople, just as it had been for 140 years, since the Emperor Constantine moved the centre of the Roman state to this new Rome at the Bosphorus. The main difference between the Latin West and its eastern brother, largely made up of the consumed Hellenic successor states to the empire of Alexander the Great, was the everyday usage in the East of Greek as the primary tongue. Despite the colossal influence the classical Greeks had had on the Roman Republic and its successor empire, particularly in the East, which still saw itself as the successor of Augustus, even in the High Middle Ages. It was this linguistic difference that would ultimately lead to estrangement between the two halves over the centuries, and eventually outright hostility and war. In 476 though, that was long in the future. With Zeno at the helm and Odoacer as the governor of Italy, all the empire had to do was endure, enriching the imperial treasury in a way that hadn't been possible in decades, shore up the defences of the state, and look to the west with hopes of more revival. By that time, Constantinople had grown to an impressive size. Safe behind the Theodosian walls, built in the 440s to keep out the Huns, with a population of perhaps as much as 400,000, it had likely surpassed Rome in size and splendour, and would only continue to grow. by the time of the Emperor Justinian in the 530s, likely reaching around 500,000. Though its fortunes would ebb and flow over the ensuing 1,000 years, the Eastern Empire would survive, reaching another apogee around the year 1000, before entering a slow decline until its final end in 1453. All the while seeing itself as the legitimate heir to the Romans of old, its citizens calling themselves that until the very end. So, now that we have seen both halves of the ailing empire, what of the world beyond these heartlands? What had happened to the provinces of the West in the decades since they had fallen under the sway of outside invasion? First, we will turn to the Danube frontier, where the borders were first broken in the 370s AD, the land's longest under the sway of barbarian chiefs and kings. Of all the barbarian peoples to establish states during the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the Gepids remain one of the most powerful, yet little known. Few archaeological sites and even fewer literary mentions of them are to be found in conventional histories. And yet, in 454 AD, it was they, under their king, a warlord named Ardaric, who led an alliance of formerly subject peoples against the sons of Attila at the Battle of Nidau, destroying the Hunnic Empire for good in the process. A state which had held much of Europe in thrall for half a century and more, likely having fallen under the sway of the Huns as early as the 370s, and now finally free to dictate their own affairs once more after the death of the all-powerful Attila. The Gepids, like many of the other subject nations of the Hunnic Empire, forged a substantial kingdom of their own. This one centred on the former Roman province of Dacia on the Middle Danube frontier, in modern-day Romania. Based out of the former provincial capital of Sirmium, the Gepids held a number of formerly Roman towns and cities, and those situated right on the border of the former empire, compared to the other Middle Danubian kingdoms, like the Ostrogoths, they seem to have had little to do with Rome. Though unfortunately, not much is known of the Gepids, due to their non-participation in Roman affairs, and the relatively short lifespan of their kingdom. A picture of a very different state to much of the rest of Europe emerges. Far from the Visigoths and the Vandals, for example, who had been Christian for decades and well used to the Roman world, the Gepids are thought to have still been staunch pagans in the last decades of the 5th century. By 537 AD, left to dictate their own affairs in isolation, the Gepids reached the very peak of their power, able to command other subject peoples, just as their Hunnic masters had once done. By 552 AD, the final end for the kingdom came, by the hands of one of those subject peoples, aided by the Eastern Empire, the Lombards. Though not much is known about the Gepids, and their kingdom lasted only 100 years, it actually remains one of the most important and long-lasting of the so-called barbarian kingdoms to arise in the wake of Rome, outlived only by a handful of others. In 476, the Gepids may have been one of the foremost powers in Europe, And at that stage, anything could have happened. Had the dice rolled differently, it could have been them who forged the modern nation of Gepidia. When the ousted emperor Julius Nepos fled Italy to his home province of Dalmatia in 475, he soon succeeded in rallying together the last vestiges of imperial authority in the region, forging something of a rump empire which functioned independently for a time, in opposition to that of his former Magister Militum, Orestes in Ravenna. After Orestes' killing in 476, Julius Nepos continued ruling in Dalmatia as the last legitimate claimant to the Western Empire. Though not allowing the Dalmatian any real power, the new overlord of Italy, Odoacer, actually even minted coins in Nepos' name. In Dalmatia, where the colossal ruins of the palace of Diocletian can still be seen today at the heart of the modern city of Split, legions of hardy warrior emperors had been born and raised for more than 200 years. One of the most Romanised and important parts of the Western Empire, it had been an independent province since 454, when Nepos' uncle Marcellinus had split away from the empire in reaction to Flavius Aetius' murder in that year. Following its first bout of independence in the 450s, for a brief while under the Emperor Majorian, Dalmatia had again been a quasi-part of the Western Empire, as Marcellinus worked side by side with the new Emperor Majorian on his great plan of restoration. After Majorian's murder in 461, however, Dalmatia had fully split away from Italian rule, effectively being ruled as an independent province from then on. Salona was the capital city of the state. In those days, an impressive sight still, with at least 30,000 inhabitants, great city walls, aqueducts, innumerable ancient temples and newer churches, and even old imperial forums. In 476, the city was still in good shape. Julius Nepos quite likely residing in the palace of Diocletian, built near Salona some 170 years before by that great emperor himself. It would be many decades yet, if not centuries, before the real rot set in. With huge migrations of Slavic newcomers coming into the region to reforge it in their own image. Of those brief 4 years in which Julius Nepos reigned in Dalmatia, tantalisingly little is known. None of his actions or laws have been preserved, though we can assume that he continued his attempts to regain control of Italy until the very end, likely receiving little support from the Emperor Zeno at Constantinople in order to do so. In 480, he too was murdered by 2 of his high-ranking Germanic generals, Ovida and Viator, very likely at his residence in the palace of Diocletian. By 482, the realm of Julius Nepos had been annexed by Odoacer, thus officially becoming part of the Eastern Roman Empire again, together with Odoacer's Italy. But outside imperial lands, to the south and the east, innumerable Germanic tribes set their plans into motion. When the Huns first arrived on the shores of the Black Sea, in the latter half of the 4th century, Entire nations and tribes were set in motion before them. When two groups of Goths, the Tuvingi and the Greatungi, were granted passage into the empire in the 370s, it not only set in motion events that would culminate in the sack of Rome in 410 and the establishment of an independent Visigothic kingdom within the borders of the empire, but also drove an irreconcilable wedge between them and the rest of the Goths, who were left subject to Hunnic rule beyond the Danube. Some 70 years later, after the final breakup of Attila's empire in the 450s, those Visigoths who'd entered the Roman Empire, now ruling over their own state in Gaul, and their Ostrogoth cousins who remained outside, had drifted a great deal. Staunchly militaristic warriors bred in the chaos of the Danube frontier, the Ostrogoths had been some of the greatest allies to Attila, providing much of the muscle of his various campaigns against the Western and Eastern empires. Though, after his death, finally free to dictate their own affairs once more, they seem to have opted to work with the empire rather than against it. A treaty was soon made, allowing their official settlement in the former Roman province of Pannonia, and even in parts of Illyricum not far from Dalmatia. Not much is known about how exactly they governed that realm in those times, but we can assume that they likely settled, like many other Germanic tribes during those days, within the still surviving Roman cities, and were, as a consequence, Romanized to some extent. Like most of the Germanic tribes to enter the empire, becoming adherents to Arian Christianity. For around 30 years, the Ostrogoths ruled in their new territory, led by various chiefs and kings. This was the situation in 476 AD. Though still martial through and through, time and time again they proved to be a threat to the Eastern Empire. Some of their rulers launching raids and disrupting trade routes. By the end of the century, the Emperor Zeno, sensing an opportunity to set enemy on enemy, put his own plans in motion. During the later years of the Emperor's rule, Odoacer had become more and more independent, and since he was, officially at least, a subject of Zeno, this could not be tolerated. Choosing a particularly promising young Ostrogothic ruler from the princes of Pannonia, Zeno would endow him with the much lauded status of Federati, dispatching him with his new high-status position to Italy to depose Odoacer, said to have had his own long-standing feud with the King of Italy. The young Ostrogoth ruler was only too happy to oblige. His name was Theodoric, and he was destined to become one of the greatest of all rulers of the 5th and 6th centuries. After several years of conflict in the late 480s and early 490s, Odoacer was finally defeated and personally killed by Theodoric himself, and a new kingdom of the Ostrogoths established on the territory of Odoacer's realm, which, at least on paper, was still a part of the Eastern Empire. But what of the other nations that had made up Attila's realm, said to have once stretched from the Balkans to the Baltic Sea? Though, like all the so-called barbarian peoples, their origins are shrouded in myth and legend. In the early 4th century AD, a new group of peoples are mentioned in the Roman sources as having settled at the edges of the Roman world, in what is today Hungary. Mentioned previously by the likes of Tacitus and Ptolemy during the very height of the empire, the Rugii, or perhaps their ruling elites, may have originated further north. Perhaps having become embroiled in the myriad series of migrations that took place in those centuries, a vast number of participants of which were destined to be subject to the great king Attila. Like so many other Germanic tribes forced into submission and servitude by the hordes of Attila the Hun, alongside the Gepids and the Ostrogoths, the Rugii were able to successfully rebel in 453 after the demise of the great king. Ultimately, by 476, having claimed and settled the former imperial provinces of Eastern Raetia and Noricum, as well as beyond the Danube in their original lands. Fascinatingly, unlike most events of this chaotic period, here we actually do have an excellent literary source, allowing us to hear what life under the Rugii may actually have been like, albeit from the perspective of a Roman. The Vita Sancti Severini, or the Life of Saint Severin, written by the monk Eugipius in the late 400s, is a unique literary source, describing the life of the monk Severin, active in exactly the area where the Rugii settled, from around 450 to the 470s, an area which would become known as Rugiland. From Eugipius's book, we can clearly see that the settlement was by no means always peaceful, with the Romans and the Rugii often clashing with one another. Many Roman settlements being abandoned, with the populations fleeing towards larger fortified cities, such as Loricum, modern-day Enns in Austria. The settlement of the Rugii occasionally may have been peaceful, with movement into some of the already inhabited Roman cities. Other times they settled in abandoned forts and ruins, already evacuated by the Romans. Overall though, this was a time of violence and chaos, when anyone could find themselves turned into a slave. Though central Roman authority had completely collapsed in the 450s in Raetia and Noricum due to the invasions, in Noricum, Severinus tried to negotiate as best as he could, we're told, apparently succeeding in saving many Romans from death and enslavement, and negotiating peace treaties with the Germanic newcomers. In the mass movements that followed, many Romans fled back to Italy in those days. Odoacer himself actually ordered the evacuation of all Romans from the Danube provinces to Italy, perhaps seeking to utilise them in his state apparatus. He later defeated the Rugii in 487 and 488, incorporating them into his domain. Thus, the kingdom of the Rugii was very short-lived, never again being powerful enough to establish their own kingdom. Though Rugii are recorded as having fought alongside Theodoric the Great in his invasion of Italy, and still being around in the mid-6th century, after which they fade into obscurity. In Noricum, they mixed with the remaining Roman population and the other Germanic tribes that would settle the area later. before the arrival of the Slavs. But there were many other barbarian peoples too, to the west and the north. Ever since the Romans first pushed into Germania in the 1st century AD, ultimately being handed a humiliating defeat at the Teutoburg forest, the Rhine River had formed a natural barricade between the so-called civilized Roman world and Barbaricum beyond. Footholds beyond the far side of the great river were established every now and again, though by the 200s, during an age of widespread instability, the former province of Agri Decumates was given up for good. One of the most important of the Germanic tribes, and a group who would move into that former Roman province, were the Alemanii. Innumerable Alemannic kings are recorded in the Roman sources as both major enemies of the Western Empire and sometimes auxiliary allies. On one notable occasion in 357, the Emperor Julian just narrowly avoided the total collapse of the Rhine frontier by defeating a coalition of Alemanii at Strasbourg and taking their king, Cnodomarius, prisoner to Rome. And at Solicinium in 368, it was Valentinian's turn to narrowly defeat yet another incursion. After decades of service to Attila and the Huns, the 450s finally saw the Alemanii free again. On one notable occasion in 457, sweeping all the way down into Italy with a large force, where they were finally defeated by Majorian. By the 470s, other groups of Alemanii settled in Rhaetia, where they enter the contemporary historical sources, their settlement being described in the Vita Sancti Severini. One fascinating section details how, in 476, some of the last Western Roman military units in the area gave up their posts in the city of Batavis, modern-day Passau in Germany, to make their way to Italy in order to collect their pay, since they had not received any in years. However, as Eugipius wrote, those individuals never arrived, being killed by raiders on the way. Such was the utter chaos and brutality in those years north of the Alps. For the warlike Alemanii, this was par for the course. Like the Rugii and the other Germanic tribes, the Alemanii often settled in the old Roman military forts and other Roman cities, building upon them and adding their own meagre additions. Despite its illustrious roots and history, however, the Alemannic kingdom, and separate ethnicity even, like the Rugii, was destined to soon come to an end. Already in 496 they were defeated by Clovis the Frank, allying themselves with his adversary Theodoric instead, thus becoming part of Theodoric's kingdom. However, some years after the death of that great Ostrogothic king in 526, they were then subjugated by the Franks for good, remaining part of their kingdom for hundreds of years, until slowly beginning to transform into a part of the Holy Roman Empire. Though forgotten by most, in their prime, the Alemanii were so highly regarded that in many languages, Alemanii is still synonymous with Germany itself. Now, we must turn to the north. Far beyond the limits of the Roman world, hundreds of miles to the north even, evidence of surprisingly far-reaching connections has been excavated for well over 100 years now. In Danish bogs and Swedish burial mounds, even as far north as what is now Norway and Finland. Not just Roman trade goods like pottery and coins, but swords, shields, helmets, and other battle gear has been found in abundance, suggesting not just influence from Rome, but service in her armies during the long centuries of the empire's existence. Given the vast multitudes of enemies it faced along the Rhine frontier, and perhaps inspired by the old adage, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend," it is not so surprising that some unnamed Roman commander had the idea to send envoys to the far north, offering the glittering riches of the Mediterranean world in return for service against those tribes on the southern periphery of Scandinavia, on the Germanic frontier. What wonders those warriors must have seen in service to the emperors, even if they made it little further than the frontier. And when those roaming federati returned home, it is possible that they changed their homelands forever. Many historians think it not at all surprising that Scandinavia begins to have a verifiable pantheon of gods at this time, seeming to have been at least in part inspired by Rome. Writing, too, in the form of the runic alphabet, which appeared in the 2nd century AD, may well have been inspired by the systems seen by those mercenaries. Just maybe they brought back taxation systems too, and even knowledge of coinage and Roman-style battle tactics and defensive structures, which are seen in Jutland from this period. There even seem to have been towns that traded along the North Sea and the Rhine with the empire. By the time the empire began to collapse in the 5th century, and goods and money stopped flowing north, yet more gargantuan societal changes would be ushered in. Those who'd relied on Roman links now having to do something else to keep hold of their power. In time, Byzantium would ultimately take over as the key trading partner of the Northlands. But this would take time, and in the intervening period, there are hints of wide-roaming warrior bands and traders heading off in search of the items they'd previously received through service. Perhaps moving along similar routes they'd taken before as swords for hire, but now either in service to other Germanic warlords or themselves. The Jutes may have been one such people, originating in Jutland, and eventually thought to have at least in part settled in Britain, along with Angles and Saxons from slightly further south. But there is another group too, one even more mysterious than the others, whose ultimate fate remains completely unknown. The Herulds are said to have raided lands across Europe and beyond during the dying days of the Empire, seeking service as hired muscle in Italy and elsewhere. often making up a part of the bodyguard of Germanic rulers like Odoacer and Theodoric, whilst also being mentioned in near contemporary sources as having ravaged Hispania and Gaul in lightning, hit-and-run raids. For more than 100 years now, since the days of J.B. Berry, it has been argued that Herul is another name for Danes and Swedes. Further south, many other tribes, such as Saxons, Thuringians, Angles and Frisians, lived on territories that either had not at all or only briefly been occupied by the Romans, often centuries before. These kingdoms and clans had established their domains on the lands of Germania Magna, that had almost become a Roman province in the early 1st century AD, until their ancestors brutally threw the Romans back at the Teutoburg forest, continuing to be an annoyance ever since. Like Scandinavia, this was a region of modest settlements, with a technological level generally far below that of the Romans. Until the latter days of the empire anyway. They lived in wooden houses, had no infrastructure to speak of, and nothing that could be called a city. For the most part, their towns had not been connected to the advanced Roman road network, and their commerce was limited to local business with neighbouring tribes. Yet, nevertheless, things would change, for these were the peoples that would eventually, slowly transform into the many different nations that would later inhabit the Holy Roman Empire, and the Germany we know today. In the centuries immediately following 476, in Frisia in particular, this region would flourish into one of the most important trading regions in Europe, ever spurred on by probably the greatest power in Western Europe during that age. We don't know for certain, but when Childeric, one king of the Franks among many, said to be descended from a sea god, fought at the Battle of the Catalonian Fields in 451, he likely stood in the service of the Roman Aetius against the horde of Attila, but also very likely against his distant kinsman fighting in the Hunnic Confederation. Seen in archaeology as well as in legend, Childeric stood at the veiled precipice where mythic past and verifiable history entwine, the Franks being some of the only Roman successor kingdoms to have quite a bit of written history of their own, namely the epic History of the Franks, written by Gregory of Tours in the next century. Utilising this alongside the contemporary Gallic records, we can arrive at a surprisingly well-rounded tale of how Francia came to be. If Childeric had indeed fought for Aetius in 451, he picked the winning side that day, and by the time 2 decades had passed, his branch of Salian Franks remained the most distinguished of the bunch. And yet, in 476, the Franks were still a surprisingly small series of kingdoms, their glory days having yet to come. Already in the 4th century, the Romans had recognised the formidable fighting prowess of the Franks, beginning to make them federati allies in ever greater numbers, even settling them along the Gaulish side of the Rhine in Roman territory. It was actually the Franks who showed incredible fighting skill in 407, when the Vandals, Alans, Suevi, and other masses of Germanic tribes started to cross over the frozen Rhine in winter. We're told the Franks fought hard against the Vandals in an attempt to stop them from heading into Gaul, succeeding in killing some 20,000. Only when the Alans and other tribes arrived to help the Vandals were the Franks finally overcome. When Gaul was then later overrun, and some of the Germanic tribes established their own kingdoms, the Franks were actually quite reluctant to do the same. Only when they saw that central Roman authority was beginning to weaken did they also establish their own realm in northeastern Gaul along the River Rhine. Their capital cities being Augusta Treverorum and Colonia Agrippina. Since many of the Franks had been in Roman service for over 100 years by this time, they were a very Romanized people. In the waning years of the Western Roman Empire, to tell the difference between a Roman and a Frank would not have been an easy task. Their Limitani soldiers still continued fighting for the Western Roman Empire throughout the 5th century. And in 476, Childeric continued to see himself as a Western Roman federati, an ally of the Western Empire, and its governor Syagrius ruling over a much reduced province to the west. Only upon Childeric's death in 481, and the accession of his ambitious young son, Clovis, did the aggressive expansionism of the Franks begin in earnest. Through decades of war, conquest, and politicking, they would expand from their still quite modest realm of 476 to a sizable kingdom. An incredible feat. In just a few decades, Clovis had succeeded in forging not just one of the largest contemporary European states, but the longest lasting kingdom of all the Germanic realms, transforming over many years into the impressively large kingdom of Charlemagne. And later, over many more centuries, into the modern country we still see today. But there were many other so-called barbarians too, who also largely remained allies of Rome. When the Magister Militum Ricimer began his reign of terror in the 460s and 470s, he did so with often eager support from one of the most influential of the so-called barbarian kingdoms to hold sway within the empire in those days. And when Ricimer died, his successor, a nephew called Gundobad, was a prince of that realm. Itself one of the most Romanized of the lot, which gives its name to regions of both France and Switzerland today. It was an independent realm for much of the Middle Ages, that very nearly became a modern nation-state of its own. They were the Burgundians, and in 476, under the firm rule of Gundobad, they were one of Europe's great powers. Like the Vandals, Suevi, and the Goths, the Burgundians were a Germanic tribe that had broken through the River Rhine, sometime after the total breakdown of its defences by 407, then succeeding in establishing a dominion of their own on the territory of the Western Empire. Already in 411, the weak Western Roman Emperor Honorius had granted the Burgundians the status of federati, giving them land to settle directly on the western bank of the Rhine River. However, despite their status as foederati, they continued to periodically raid Roman territory nonetheless. By 437, perhaps also for his own reasons, which are lost to history, the Magister Militum Aetius, along with his erstwhile Hunnic foederati, had the entire Burgundian kingdom destroyed, killing scores of men, women, and children in the process. It was an event that seems to have reverberated throughout the Germanic world to such an extent that it may have in part inspired the high medieval heroic epic of the Nibelungenlied. Some Burgundians clearly survived, however, and they would be back with a vengeance. After 443, they were resettled by Aetius to the present-day region of northeastern France and western Switzerland, where they would remain mostly unchanged for decades and centuries to come. By 476, having previously served as the last Germanic Magister Militum of the Western Empire, Gundobad had returned home to become king of his people. Julius Nepos' sizable Dalmatian army at his back. There, he and the Burgundians would prosper as a fully independent kingdom. Finally, by 534, defeated by the ever-expansionist Franks to the north, Burgundy would be incorporated into the Frankish realm. And yet, a great deal of autonomy was allowed, and time again, Burgundy would be independently ruled once more, the region still proudly bearing the name of its ancestral founders today. By the time the Roman forces in Britannia proclaimed their own emperor in 407, the island province had for all intents and purposes already been abandoned by the imperial administration of Ravenna. With massive Germanic invasions now sweeping across Gaul, and more important concerns for the court to worry about much closer to Italy, Britannia could wait. The troops in Britain, however, with a long history of having declared their own candidates for the imperial throne, set about raising their own series of so-called emperors. Most of them short-lived, until at last Constantine III, a career soldier, was hailed as the new Western Roman Emperor in direct opposition to Honorius. Soon withdrawing from Britain to the continent, along with most of his men, in order to fight against the Germanic invaders making headway there, and to shore up support for himself. As a consequence, the Romano-Britons were largely again left to their own defence. After Constantine's death in 411, as well as with the even more chaotic situation now tearing Gaul apart, the decision was made at Ravenna to officially withdraw from Britannia. Though the island was still often seen as a part of the Western Roman Empire, even by later emperors, in reality, self-rule became the norm. The archaeology suggesting a much reduced way of life, descent into a barter economy, and significant population loss. By the 450s, though the details remain obscured by patchy historical records and myth, individuals and tribes living along the Rhine frontier and the North Sea began entering the former province from the east. They were the Angles, Saxons and Jutes, and they would never leave. At the same time, the Picts of the north and Scots from across the sea in Ireland continued their invasions, making slaves of the empire which had once enslaved them. By 476 then, while the Romano-Britons still defended themselves to the west of the island, having established kingdoms there from the ashes of the imperial bureaucracy, Britannia was inhabited by a mixture of myriad nations and tribes, many of whom regularly went to war with one another. Like nowhere else in the former empire, Britannia had completely, irrevocably changed. A land of chaos. As the last Romans fortified themselves in their old bastions to the west, at sites like Cadbury Castle and Tintagel, the Germanic settlers built their own settlements, often purposely neglecting the old Roman cities, left to the ghosts of the past. The level of technology dropped sharply, and in only a century, the living standards in Britain plummeted from the highly developed Roman civilization to a level that had not been seen on the island since the Bronze Age. Some Romano-Britons fled the invasions of the Anglo-Saxons over to the mainland, settling on the area of Armorica in modern-day Brittany, which still bears their name to this day. And of course, in myth, the legendary King Arthur himself is said to have stopped the westward expansion of the Anglo-Saxons around the year 500 at the Battle of Mons Badonicus. Just across the Channel, meanwhile, even in those days, a very different Roman society still flourished. The very last time the Western Roman Empire could really be called an empire was under the firm hand of Majorian. In a brief period of just 4 years, from 457 to 461, though one filled with hope, this often neglected and underrated soldier emperor had very nearly managed to restore the territories of the realm, resubjugating the various barbarian peoples to federati status. Unfortunately, his final plan to invade Vandal Africa had failed drastically, with his fleet burning while still docked near the port of Carthage, possibly due to sabotage. While on his way back to Italy, Majorian was to suffer a treacherous betrayal, caught by the Magister Militum Ricimer, who had pretended to be his friend. According to the Roman sources, he was tortured to death. As a direct consequence, the Magister Militum Aegidius, ruling in Gaul, split away his domain from the Western Empire, just as Marcellinus did the same in Dalmatia. In northern Gaul, Aegidius continued to independently rule his realm like the Roman province it had been for going on 4 centuries. A land of relative calm amidst the storm. And when he died, possibly in 465, his son Syagrius took over. Apparently a somewhat able leader, Syagrius continued governing the realm in the same way as a regular Western Roman province had been governed. And so, his realm, sometimes also called the kingdom of Soissons still continued to exist, even after Romulus Augustus was deposed in 476. Syagrius' realm may still have been quite powerful in those days. After all, Aegidius had threatened to invade Italy to bring Ricimer to justice on multiple occasions. And the realm was able to maintain its borders for decades while surrounded by hostile foes. By 486, however, it all came to an end. The Frankish king Clovis was so sure that he would defeat Syagrius' last Western Roman troops that he even announced when and where the battle would take place. And indeed, Syagrius lost, possibly due to being outnumbered. Unfortunately, we simply don't know any details about this battle in 486. However, we can imagine that being the only Roman province in a sea of Germanic kingdoms was not advantageous from a diplomatic point of view. Thus ended this last Western Roman realm in the year 486. But there were other heavily Romanized Germanic successor states. When the great city of Rome was surrounded and plundered in the year 410, an event that sent shockwaves through both western and eastern sides of the Roman Empire. It was the first time the city had suffered such an indignity in 800 years. Far from being brought to justice in the years afterwards, such was the strength of those responsible in those days that they were able to continue their march westward, until finally they were officially granted their own territory in what had previously been southern Gaul. They were the Visigoths, arguably the most influential of the so-called barbarians who entered the empire in its dying days. And after just over 30 years inside the borders, under their ruler Alaric, they had already irrevocably changed it forevermore. Alaric would soon be dead, but his family would continue to be influential power brokers for centuries to come. One of the first dynasties in a new world beginning to coalesce. At their new power base in Aquitania, the Visigoths finally found the homeland they'd been searching for a time at least, settling down to rule in the area for the next century. But this was the 5th century, and nothing stayed the same for long. Geopolitics completely altering in the wake of the massively disastrous wars of Attila the Hun. When Attila invaded Gaul, the Visigoths remained true to their oaths, standing side by side with their Roman hosts. Together with Aetius and his Romans, the Burgundians and a number of other groups of foederati, they'd managed to defeat Attila and the vast coalition of tribes fighting under the Hunnic horde at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451. Theodoric, the king of the Visigoths for some 30 years, perhaps part of the inspiration for Theoden from The Lord of the Rings, giving his life in the battle. But when first Aetius and then Valentinian III were killed in 454 and 455 respectively, the Western Empire plunged back into complete chaos. The Visigoths, under their king Theodoric II, immediately made use of that power vacuum in order to expand their realm, invading Hispania and expanding eastward into Gaul too. For a while they were driven back, and especially under the Emperor Majorian, they suffered a batch of humiliating defeats that forced them back to the status of federati. After Majorian's murder, however, now under the rule of the ruthless Yorick, they again went on the warpath, retaking all the lands they had lost, and more. In 473, even managing to invade southern Gaul. By 475, the Emperor Julius Nepos had no choice but to accept the existence of their kingdom, even officially ceding southern Gaul to them, including the besieged Roman city of Arelette. Of all the Germanic kingdoms of 476 then, the kingdom of the Visigoths was the largest, stretching from the Rock of Gibraltar all the way deep into Gaul. When compared to many of their neighbours, they were quite Romanised, likely continuing to live in the Roman cities, leaving Roman administration and infrastructure intact, wherever they could. The Visigoths mingled with the Roman population, even adopting Latin as their primary tongue over the years. By 507, however, they were defeated badly by the Franks and forced to cede all territory north of the Pyrenees. In Hispania, their kingdom continued on for centuries, flourishing as an artistic and cultural centre of Western Europe. Only in 721 did it finally come to an end, in a great twist of history, conquered by an exiled prince of the ailing Umayyad Caliphate, once again forever altering the culture, language, and now religion of the peninsula. By the time of its conquest, the Visigothic kingdom was, after the Frankish kingdom, the second longest lived of all the Germanic realms. But they hadn't been alone in Hispania, not by a long shot. And in a completely unique situation, some of those realms even remained staunchly pagan. Like innumerable other Germanic peoples, the Suevi were part of the coalition of tribes that broke through the Rhine frontier in 407. In the following years, they roamed at will, plundering and sacking any cities and towns unfortunate enough to find themselves in their path, until, at last, they reached the western shores of Hispania, straddling the borders of modern-day Spain and Portugal. There, in 411, they established their kingdom, one of the most little-known yet powerful of all, and one of the only ones to still openly practice Germanic paganism rather than Arian Christianity. And like the other Germanic kingdoms, in time their existence would be grudgingly accepted by the Western Emperor Honorius. The capital of the Suevic kingdom was Bracara Augusta, a Roman city which, as now was tradition all over Europe, they conquered and made their own. The Suevi seem to have been content with their dominion for a time, until, like almost all of the Germanic kingdoms, they too became expansionistic, succeeding in greatly enlarging their domain by swallowing up lands of the Vandals, Alans, and Roman inhabitants of Iberia. By 446, they reached an apogee of territorial growth. This expansion was to be short-lived, as with help from the Visigoths, the Romans reconquered much of Iberia, confining the Suevi again to the western Hispanic shore. By 476 then, the territory of the Suevi was quite similar to how it had been when they had first arrived in the early 410s. Their capital city quite likely still being Bracara Augusta. By that time, however, they had converted to Arianism, a creed to which they would remain staunchly loyal until the 560s, when Catholicism was officially adopted. Finally, in 585, after 174 years as an independent political entity, the Suevic kingdom came to an end, absorbed into the now massive kingdom of the Visigoths, one of the greatest by far in all of Europe. Though they, just like the Suevi and the Vandals, perhaps mightiest of all the barbarians, would ultimately disappear from history entirely, leaving almost nothing behind. Of all the so-called barbarian kingdoms who pushed into the territory of the Western Roman Empire to forge new lands and new futures in the 5th century AD, arguably one above all the others burned brightest, the fires of their culture and very existence going out just as quickly, leaving little trace today. Though much maligned in history, largely due to the wild success of their conquests, their very name itself becoming synonymous with wanton destruction. In the year 476, the kingdom of the Vandals was one of the most powerful states in the former empire, intermarrying with the other kingdoms, dictating events far away. And in 455, in one of the last death knells of the ailing Western Roman world, even sailing across the Mediterranean to plunder and destroy the great city of Rome itself, beginning the downward tailspin to the events of 476. The real Vandals, though, as well as their Alanic allies, who formed a significant portion of their state, were far from the illiterate barbarians as they are often portrayed. Cunning strategic masterminds, expert sailors, patrons of the arts, and Christians, having developed a great deal from their forefathers who crossed over the Rhine some 70 years earlier. Those forefathers were the same Vandals who'd fought against the Franks in 407, and almost lost, but with the help of the Alans and other tribes, managed to overrun the Roman border defences at the Rhine. From there, they sacked and plundered cities throughout Gaul, marching ever southwards. Finally, in southern Hispania in the early 410s, flanked by kingdoms of the Visigoths and Suevi, they established their own realm. Content for a time to settle in one place. Ultimately, by the late 420s, conflicts with the other Germanic kingdoms would force the hand of a young Vandalic ruler. The plan was to settle over the sea in Africa, then the breadbasket of the empire, and a place filled with unbridled wealth and luxury. That young Vandalic leader who became king in 428 was Gaiseric, and he was destined to be remembered as one of the most ruthless, cunning, and long-lasting tacticians to ever fight against Rome, forcing Roman shipbuilders to work for them, and probably capturing Roman vessels too. In the fateful year 429, the entire kingdom crossed over the Straits of Gibraltar into the soft underbelly of the empire. For the next 10 years, the Vandals and the Alans waged war in Africa. Only after great losses and difficulties, finally succeeding in occupying most of the former Roman province. Every attempt to reconquer Africa for the Western Roman Empire would fail. In the 430s, in 440, again in 461, and most spectacularly in the brutal catastrophe of 468, where half the Roman fleet was destroyed by the cunning of the Vandals at Cape Bon. And as the Western Roman Empire ever weakened, so the Vandal kingdom became stronger, raiding the shores of Italy and even the Balkans and Greece, often with impunity. By 476 AD, they'd even managed to conquer the Balearic Islands, Corsica, Sardinia, and even the western tip of Sicily. During those golden years, their capital city was Carthage, and we can assume that they, like many other Germanic tribes, ruled over the Roman cities, leaving them mostly intact as they had found them, acting as new tax collectors, continuing to utilise Roman administration. Besides, in religious matters, leaving the Roman population largely to themselves. For the Vandals were Arian Christians who believed in the non-divine nature of Christ, which led to some clashes over the years with the Catholic Romans. In 476, Gaiseric still ruled over the now much expanded kingdom of the Vandals, and he would only die 1 year later, at the age of around 87. Undefeated after reigning in total for nearly 50 years. An absolutely exceptional feat for the time. During his entire lifetime, he was the bane of the Romans, almost on par with Attila the Hun, but for a much longer period. And just like Attila the Hun, after the death of Gaiseric, lesser kings followed. In 534, after less than 100 years of existence, the kingdom of the Vandals was reconquered wholesale by the Eastern Roman Empire. Something which had failed time and time again when Gaiseric was still alive. Again becoming part of the Roman Empire, which it would continue to be for almost 170 more years, until the area was finally conquered by the Umayyad Caliphate. Today, we cannot help but find fascination in the incredible chaos and complexity of the various states, realms, and kingdoms of the 5th century AD. Realms that had been established in the orbit of the dying Western Roman Empire. Some of them so short-lived, others surviving for 1,000 years or more. For out of the ashes of those kingdoms of barbarian interlopers and last Romans alike, through centuries of cultural transformations, did the modern states of Western Europe emerge. The political landscape of Europe today being a direct consequence of events playing out so long ago in the 5th century AD. Still today, in the area where the Franks had their kingdom 1,500 years ago, France is to be found. Germany is still called Alemania in some languages, incorporating the former territory of the Alemanii, as well as Saxons, Thuringians, and others still seen prominently on the map. Parts of Britain even still trace their ancestry back to the Romano-Britons of some 1500 years ago, as well as the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes. Thus, as we conclude our tour of Europe in the year 476 AD, we find a reality not so reminiscent of a cataclysmic fall of Rome, but one in which the foundations for Western civilization as we know it and our world today were laid. You've been watching History Time. My name's Pete Kelly. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Let me know what you'd like to see covered next in the comments. It really does help with the algorithm. Sign up to my free mailing list on Substack, and I'll see you next time.